welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time. Either way, there is no need to hurry. There is nothing that needs doing right now. Whatever was on your mind before you press play, or before you open this, or before you settled in, you can set it down for a while. It will still be there later if you want it. But for now, there is only this. We are going to talk about ancient markets, not the dramatic version, not the version where exciting things happen, and colourful characters shout and bargain and the whole scene crackles with energy. We are going to talk about what ancient markets were actually like, which is to say we are going to talk about them slowly and in some detail, focusing on the ordinary parts, the unremarkable parts, the parts that happened the same way, day after day, season after season, for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. This is that kind of story. Let us begin at the beginning, which is to say, let us begin before the market even opens. In most ancient cultures, the market did not simply appear. People prepared for it. Producers, farmers, craftspeople, herders, fishermen spent the days before the Saget gathering and organising what they intended to sell or trade. A farmer might bundle up a quantity of grain, or tie together dried herbs, or load root vegetables into a basket. A potter might wrap finished clay vessels in straw to protect them during transport. A weaver might fold finished lengths of cloth. A cheesemaker might wrap rounds of hard cheese in cloth. The preparation was careful, because goods that arrived at market damaged or disorganized were harder to sell. A cracked pot was worth less than a whole one. Grain that had gotten wet and begun to smell was worth less than dry grain. The presentation of goods, even in ancient markets where the expectations were modest by modern standards, mattered to some degree. Then the goods had to be transported. Transport to market was done in the ways available, which depended on the culture, the geography, and the resources of the individual. In some places and times, people carried their goods on their own backs, in baskets or bundles or sacks. This was common for shorter distances and smaller quantities. For larger quantities or longer distances, animals were used: donkeys, horses, camels, oxen, depending on where in the ancient world we are talking about. The animal carried the load while the person walked alongside or occasionally rode. In places with rivers or canals, water transport was often the most efficient option. A boat loaded with produce could carry more than many donkeys and required less active management during the journey. Goods were loaded at the bank. The boat was pushed off, and it moved downriver or along the canal toward the market town, with the current helping or the boatman paddling or poling as needed. The journey to market might take hours, or in some cases days. Merchants who came from distant places arrived the evening before market day and found somewhere to sleep, an inn if one existed, or simply an open space near the market where travellers were known to camp. They unloaded their animals or covered their boats, and they slept, and in the morning they set up their selling space. Let us talk about setting up. Setting up a market stall in ancient times involved primarily finding a spot. Markets in established towns often had customary arrangements. Certain sellers always set up in certain places, and these arrangements were understood if not always formally recorded. The potter went to the pottery section. The grain sellers gathered in the grain area. The butchers were in one part of the market, usually downwind of everything else for obvious reasons. These arrangements were not accidental. They served the buyers, who learned where to go for what they needed, and they served the sellers, who benefited from being near others selling similar goods because buyers, looking for one kind of thing, would naturally compare options. A stall was a simple thing. In many cases it was simply a mat or a cloth spread on the ground, on which goods were arranged. In more developed markets, wooden structures, trestle tables, simple shelving, awnings held up by poles, provided more organised display space and some protection from the weather. But the simplest and most common form was the ground cloth, with goods laid out on it in whatever arrangement seemed sensible. Sensible arrangement was thought about to some degree. Things that should be visible were placed at the front. Things that were fragile were placed where they would not be stepped on. Things that were heavy were placed where they would not tip over. A seller who thought carefully about arrangement could catch the eye of a passing buyer more easily than one who did not. And then the waiting began. Waiting is a large part of what ancient market selling was. You set up your goods. Buyers came and looked. Some bought. Most looked and moved on. You waited for the next buyer. You watched the market around you. You noticed what was selling well and what was not. You talked to the seller next to you, if they were the kind of person who talked, or you sat in comfortable silence if they were not. The pace of transactions was unhurried. Prices were not fixed in the way modern prices are fixed. There was no tag on the goods saying what they cost. Instead, prices were negotiated or established through back-and-forth conversation, or set by custom that everyone understood. A buyer approached, looked at the goods, and asked or implied a question about price. The seller named a figure. The buyer considered. Perhaps they offered a lower figure. The seller considered. Perhaps they came down slightly. Perhaps they did not. The buyer considered again. Eventually they agreed on a price, or the buyer moved on to look elsewhere. This process of price negotiation was not especially dramatic. It was simply the ordinary mechanism of market exchange in a world without fixed prices. Both parties knew roughly what things were worth, because they had both participated in many such negotiations before, and extreme prices in either direction would simply fail to result in a transaction. The negotiation was a form of social exchange as much as an economic one. A brief conversation, a bit of back and forth, an agreement reached. Then the goods changed hands and the money or barter goods changed hands in the other direction, and both parties moved on. Let us talk about what was actually sold in ancient markets. The specifics varied enormously by culture and geography and period, but some categories were nearly universal. Food was always the most important category, because everyone needed to eat, and most people could not produce everything they needed themselves. Grain was sold, wheat, barley, millet, and whatever the local staple happened to be. It was sold in measured quantities, using standard vessels or weights that both buyer and seller were familiar with. The grain might be raw, kernels to be ground at home, or it might already be flour. The grain seller might also sell bread, already baked, for buyers who did not have time or facilities to bake their own. Hot food, ready to eat at the market or taken away, was sold in many ancient markets in exactly the way that street food is sold today. Vegetables and fruit were sold when in season. This was fresh produce, gathered that morning or the day before, and it needed to be sold before it wilted or rotted, which created a certain pressure on the vegetable seller that the grain seller did not face. A jar of grain would wait patiently for a buyer. A bunch of fresh herbs would not wait quite so long. Meat was sold at market by butchers who either slaughtered animals at the market itself or brought already butchered cuts. Fish was sold at markets near water, near rivers, near the sea, near lakes, and the fish was fresh if the market was close to the source, or dried or salted if it had travelled a distance. Dried fish kept well, and was sold even at inland markets far from water. Oil was sold. In the Mediterranean world, olive oil was the primary cooking and lighting fat, and it was sold in ceramic vessels of various sizes. You brought your own container, or you bought a sealed vessel, and the oil was measured and transferred. Measuring oil was a slightly messy business, involving pourers and funnels and drips on the ground. Salt was sold. Salt was important enough in some ancient economies to function almost like a currency, and it was traded over considerable distances. A market in an area without local salt production would have a salt seller who had brought salt from somewhere that had it, and the price would reflect the distance travelled. Pottery was sold, the everyday ceramic vessels that everyone needed for storage, cooking, serving, and carrying water. Pottery was breakable, and it broke, and it needed to be replaced, which made the pottery seller a reliable fixture of any market. Pots came in many sizes and shapes, each suited to particular uses, and a buyer choosing a pot would turn it over, look at the base, tap it gently to listen for the clear ring of uncracked clay versus the dull thud of a crack, and assess it carefully before agreeing to a price. Cloth was sold. Finished woven cloth, in length suitable for making into garments, was sold by cloth merchants who might have produced it themselves or might have traded for it from producers elsewhere. The quality of cloth varied considerably, from rough utility fabric to finer weaves, and the price varied accordingly. Buyers who knew about cloth felt the weave between their fingers, held it up to the light, assessed the evenness of the thread, and made their judgment accordingly. Tools were sold. Metal tools, knives, needles, awls, small farming implements were the products of smiths, and smiths were specialized enough that most communities had access to only one or a few. The market was where people who did not live near a smith could acquire metal tools or replace broken ones. Metal was expensive, and metal tools were treated with care and kept for as long as possible. Let us now slow down and simply spend time in one corner of an ancient market. Let us say we are in a market in a medium-sized town in ancient Rome, perhaps in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. The market is held in the Forum, the central open space of the town surrounded by covered walkways, the porticus, that provide shade and shelter. The morning is already warm, it is summer, and the sun comes down on the pale stone of the Forum with some intensity. Around the edges of the open space, under the porticus, sellers have set up their goods on wooden trestle tables. In the centre of the open space, a few more sellers have arranged themselves on the ground with awnings stretched above them on poles to provide shade. The Forum smells of many things, the oil being sold by a merchant near the eastern colonnade, the fish being sold near the centre, the bread from a baker's stall at the corner, and underneath it all the general smell of a gathering of people and goods and animals in a warm town. Let us stand near the pottery stall. The pottery seller is a middle-aged man, broad-shouldered from years of working clay and carrying heavy loads. He has laid out his wares on a wide trestle table. Stacks of plain terra sigillata bowls, several large storage amphorae standing upright on the ground behind the table, a collection of smaller juglets and oil lamps, and a row of courseware cooking pots in graduated sizes. Everything is neatly arranged. The man knows his stock well enough to see at a glance if something has been moved or if a particular piece is missing. He's not actively selling right now. A buyer is not present at this exact moment. He's standing behind his table, arms folded, watching the foot traffic in the forum with the patient expression of someone who has been here many times before. He knows that buyers will come. They always do. The question is when and how many and what they will want to buy. A woman passes by carrying a basket. She slows as she passes the pottery stall, looking at the smaller juglets. She picks one up, turns it over, looks at the base. She sets it down and picks up another, slightly larger. She holds it at arm's length and looks at the shape of it. She puts it down. She moves on without speaking. The pottery seller watches this without expression. She was not ready to buy today. Perhaps she will come back. Perhaps she will not. Either way, his expression does not change. A few minutes pass. A young man comes to the table and points at one of the oil lamps. He asks a question, the price, and the pottery seller names a figure. The young man looks at the lamp, looks at the seller, offers a lower figure. The seller shakes his head, offers a figure between the two. The young man considers, looks at the lamp again, reaches into a small purse at his belt and puts coins on the table. The seller counts them, adds them to the leather pouch at his side, and the young man takes the lamp and leaves. The seller returns to his watching. This is a morning at the pottery stall. Let us now move to the grain sellers, which are gathered in the north end of the forum. There are 3 grain sellers today, and they are placed near enough to each other that buyers can compare without walking far. Each has sacks of grain propped open at the front of their space, so that buyers can see the quality, the size and colour of the kernels, the absence of grit or chaff, the general cleanliness of the grain. One seller is also selling flour already ground in smaller cloth bags. The tools for measuring grain are on the table, a standard-sized wooden measure used to scoop grain from a sack and level the top, and a set of bronze weights for weighing the scoopful on a small bronze scale. The weights are small, precise-looking things, made to a standard that is recognized across the region. Using standard weights is important, because the buyer can check them against reference weights, known quantities carried for this purpose. And a seller who tried to use false weights would quickly become known for it. Measuring grain is a careful process. The buyer names a quantity. The seller scoops, levels, and weighs. Sometimes the first measurement is slightly over, and a few kernels are removed until the weight is right. Sometimes it is slightly under, and a few are added. The precision required is modest. The scales are not highly sensitive, but both parties pay attention. This is food. It matters. The grain sellers talk to each other occasionally, in the comfortable way of people who compete in proximity and have therefore developed a working relationship that is not quite friendship but is not unfriendly either. They share information about prices from other markets, about weather that might affect future harvests, about which buyers are reliable and which tend to argue. Let us walk now toward the edge of the market, where the smell indicates the presence of the food sellers. Hot food at ancient markets was common and important. Not everyone buying at market lived close enough to cook a meal before the long walk or ride home. Not everyone had a proper cooking set up at home. Urban dwellers in ancient cities often lived in multi-story insulae, apartment blocks, where individual cooking fires were a fire hazard, and so they bought cooked food from sellers rather than making it themselves. The food sellers served a real need. The food on offer is simple. Flatbread, still warm from the portable clay oven the seller has set up near her space. Bean stew in a large ceramic pot served into buyers' own bowls or into the seller's small serving dishes for consumption on the spot. Roasted nuts wrapped in leaves, a sweet made from honey and grain cut into small pieces and sold individually. The seller is a woman of perhaps 50, competent and quick. She serves buyers efficiently, using a long-handled ladle for the stew, tearing bread from larger rounds with experienced hands. She takes coins or accepts barter, a small piece of cloth, a handful of herbs, with equal ease. She does not haggle much. Her prices are known and fair, and people come to her regularly enough that the price does not need to be renegotiated each time. A man sits nearby on a low wall, eating his bread and stew. He eats without hurry, watching the market. He has already done his buying. The basket beside him holds some grain and a piece of cloth, and now he is eating before the walk home. He is not thinking about anything particular. He is simply sitting in the sun, eating his lunch in the middle of the market, in the middle of the morning, in the middle of an ordinary day. This is what ancient markets looked like from the inside. Let us now consider the sounds. A market is not silent. The forum today is filled with the sounds of people and commerce and the life of a town. There is a general murmur of conversation, negotiations, greetings, casual talk. There is the sound of coins being counted, which is a small metallic clicking sound. There is the sound of ceramic being handled, the soft thump of a pot set down on a wooden table, the scraping sound of a sack of grain being shifted. There is the distant lowing of an animal being brought to the livestock section of the market, outside the forum proper. There is the sound of someone calling out their goods, not theatrical hawking, but a simple repetitive announcement of what they are selling and at what price, the ancient equivalent of a sign. These sounds layer over each other and produce the general ambient noise of a busy market, which is loud enough to make conversation require some effort, but not so loud as to be overwhelming. After a while, the individual sounds stop being individually noticeable and become simply the sound of market, the background noise of a familiar and ordinary place. The smells of the market also layer. Closest is whatever is nearest to you, the oil, the bread, the fish. Further away the smells are indistinct, a general complex of food and animals and people and sun-warmed stone. The market has a smell that is its own, distinct from the smell of the surrounding town, which is distinct from the smell of the countryside outside the town. Each environment has its characteristic smell, and people who move between them notice the transitions without thinking much about them. Underfoot, the stone of the forum is worn smooth by years of foot traffic. In the areas around the stalls, the stone is sometimes slick with oil or wet from spilled water or fish. People navigate, without thinking about it, their feet finding these stable places automatically, the way feet do in familiar terrain. Let us now think about the buyers, because we have been spending time with the sellers. Buyers at an ancient market came from various backgrounds and with various purposes. A wealthy household might send a slave or a servant to do the daily marketing, to buy the food and the oil and whatever else the household needed that day. The servant moved through the market with a list or with a mental inventory of what was needed, and they spent the household's money carefully, knowing that their employer paid attention to costs. A small farmer who had come from outside the town to sell some goods at market might also buy things while in town, items that were not available in the countryside, or that were better or cheaper in the town market. Metal tools, certain spices, ready-made pottery. They made their purchases and then loaded everything back onto their animal for the journey home. An artisan in town might come to market to buy raw materials, a dyer to buy natural pigments, a leather worker to buy hides that had been tanned by a specialist, a baker to buy grain. These were business purchases made with professional attention to quality and price. And then there were people who came to the market simply because it was there, because it was the most active social space in the town, the place where you encountered people and heard news and saw what was happening. These buyers might make small purchases or might not buy at all, but they were part of the market in the sense that their presence contributed to the general activity and made the space feel like the centre of something. The market was, in most ancient towns and cities, exactly that, the centre of something. The economic centre, certainly, but also the social and informational centre. News travelled through markets. You heard about distant events, a military campaign, change in the price of a major commodity, a disruption to trade routes, from merchants who had come from elsewhere and brought news with their goods. You heard local news too, who had married, who had died, what had happened in the next village, what the magistrate had decided about the dispute over the boundary of the field to the west of the town. Markets were where information lived and moved. Let us now think about a very different ancient market, to understand that the experience varied considerably. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the great cities of Ur and Babylon and Nineveh, markets had a character shaped by the urban density and administrative complexity of those places. These were large cities, by ancient standards, with populations of tens of thousands. Feeding such a population required organized systems of supply and distribution that went beyond the simple weekly market of a small town. The palace and temple institutions of Mesopotamian cities were themselves major economic actors. They owned land, they organized the labor of farmers, they received agricultural products as taxes or offerings, they distributed food and goods to workers, craftspeople and officials who worked for them. This institutional economy coexisted with private trade, and the two were intertwined in complex ways that historians still work to understand. A market area in Babylon might be situated near the river, where boats could unload directly. The goods arriving by river included grain from the agricultural hinterland, timber from the mountains to the north, copper from distant mining regions, lapis lazuli from even more distant places. These goods moved through Babylon in networks of merchants who were sometimes working for themselves and sometimes working as agents for larger institutions. The Mesopotamian merchant, called a tamkarum in the Akkadian language, was a recognized professional figure. They had legal standing, they entered into written contracts recorded on clay tablets, and they operated within a system of law that defined their rights and obligations. The Code of Hammurabi, the famous legal code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, contains several laws specifically addressing commercial transactions, the terms of merchant partnerships, the liability of agents who lose goods in transit, The interest rates on commercial loans. Interest rates. That ancient merchants paid interest on commercial loans is worth noting, because it illustrates how developed ancient commercial systems were. A merchant who needed capital to fund a trading expedition might borrow silver, the primary medium of exchange in ancient Mesopotamia, from a temple institution or a wealthy individual, travel to trade, return with profit, repay the loan with interest, and keep the remainder. This is a recognizable commercial logic that has not changed in its basic form in thousands of years. The repayment of loans, the settling of accounts, the recording of transactions, these happened in the market or in the spaces adjacent to it, and they required the presence of scribes who could write the relevant documents on clay tablets. The clay tablet records of ancient Mesopotamian commerce are some of the most detailed sources we have for understanding ancient economic life, precisely because they recorded the mundane details of everyday transactions with careful specificity. A tablet might record, on such and such a day, in the year of the reign of so-and-so, merchant X received from institution Y a quantity of silver to be invested in a trading expedition to a certain place, to be repaid with such and such interest upon return, signed with the seals of both parties and the witness. This was not exciting to the people who wrote it. It was paperwork, ancient paperwork, pressed into clay with a reed stylus instead of filled in on a form, but paperwork in spirit. The markets of Mesopotamia also had a physical character shaped by the materials of the region. Mud brick, the primary building material of the flat river plain, where stone and timber were scarce, produced a particular kind of architecture. Market buildings where they existed were thick-walled mud brick structures that stayed relatively cool inside even in summer. Goods were displayed in covered archways and open courtyards. The dust of the city was everywhere, fine, pale, pervasive, settling on everything and requiring constant sweeping. Let us now move to ancient China, because the Chinese market tradition was different from both the Mediterranean and the Mesopotamian in interesting ways. In ancient China, markets were often regulated more strictly than in other ancient cultures. The Chinese state from early periods took an active interest in commercial activity and sought to control it, both to extract revenue through taxes and to prevent merchants from accumulating too much independent wealth and power. Merchants in the Confucian social hierarchy were ranked below farmers and craftspeople, which is somewhat ironic given how essential they were to the economy. But the ranking reflected a philosophical preference for productive labour over exchange. Markets in Chinese cities were often confined to designated market areas, opening at specific times and closing at others, regulated by market officials who monitored weights and measures and collected taxes. The regulated nature of these markets did not make them less busy. They were extremely busy during the hour they were open, but it gave them a particular orderly character shaped by official oversight. The goods available in Chinese markets were diverse, reflecting the vast geography of China and the extensive internal trade networks that connected different regions. Silk was perhaps the most famous Chinese trade good, produced in the east and traded westward as well as across China itself. Rice from the south, tea, which by later periods had become an important commodity, lacquerware and ceramics of high quality, raw materials like hemp and cotton for textile production, iron goods from regions with good iron deposits. the silk trade deserves a moment, because silk was genuinely remarkable. The process of producing silk, raising silkworms, feeding them mulberry leaves, harvesting the cocoons, unreeling the long continuous filament of silk from each cocoon, spinning and weaving, was labour-intensive and required specialised knowledge. The resulting fabric was light, strong, lustrous, and comfortable against skin in both heat and cold. It was also expensive, which made it a luxury good in the markets of the ancient world. The Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia and ultimately to the Mediterranean, brought Chinese silk to Roman markets, and Romans found it as remarkable as their trading partners in the East intended them too. Roman writers commented on silk as a luxury, fabric of unusual quality. The price of silk in Rome reflected the enormous distance it had travelled to get there, but most silk was traded within China itself, or in the adjacent regions. Most silk buyers were not Roman emperors, but Chinese nobles and officials and wealthy merchants, and at the markets where silk was sold, the transaction was unremarkable. A negotiation over quantity and price, a transfer of goods and silver, a buyer walking away with a carefully folded length of fabric. We should now spend some time in an ancient market that is less often imagined, a market in ancient West Africa. West African markets in ancient and medieval times were important nodes in extensive trade networks. The great empires of the Western Sudan, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, were built in large part on control of trade routes, particularly the trans-Saharan routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world via the Sahara Desert, the most important commodity moving northward across the Sahara was gold. West Africa, particularly the regions of modern Ghana and Mali, had substantial gold deposits, and West African gold found its way to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, and eventually to Europe. Moving southward across the Sahara came salt. The great salt mines of the Sahara produced blocks of salt that were desperately needed in the salt-scarce regions further south. The exchange of gold for salt, two commodities whose value was profound and whose geographical sources were separated by vast distances, was the engine of enormous trading systems. In the markets of ancient West Africa, this exchange happened alongside countless other transactions of more local scope. A market in a West African town, let us say a market town on the edge of the Sahel, the zone between the desert and the savannah, might be held weekly or every few days. Traders came from surrounding villages, bringing agricultural produce, millet, sorghum, dried, beans, groundnuts, smoked fish from the nearby river. Craftspeople brought their goods, iron tools made by smiths who were hereditary specialists in their craft, leather goods, pottery, woven cloth. The market was noisy and social in the way of all markets everywhere. Women traders in particular were prominent, as they have been in West African markets throughout history. Experienced, skilled in negotiation, knowledgeable about prices and quality, and embedded in social networks that both supported their trading activities and depended on them. The currency used varied by region and period. Cowrie shells were widely used as currency across much of West Africa. Small, light, uniform in size, and durable. Strips of cloth served as currency in some contexts. Gold dust, carefully weighed on small balance scales with standardized weights, was the currency of larger transactions. The weighing of gold dust was a careful process. The dust was kept in small leather pouches and poured into one pan of the scale while standard weights were placed in the other. When the scale balanced, the transaction was complete. The weights were small brass castings in various shapes, and the system of weights was well understood by everyone participating in the market. Cheating in the weight system was possible and certainly happened, but it was also detectable, and a merchant known for short measures would find their trading opportunities diminished. Let us return to a simpler image now and spend time there. We're in a small market in a village in ancient Greece, perhaps 500 years before the Common Era. The market, the agora, is a modest open space near the centre of the village, a few dozen paces across. It is held every 8 or 10 days, timed to a local religious calendar. Most sellers are farmers from the surrounding countryside, and most buyers are villagers or farmers from nearby areas. The goods available are modest and local: olives and olive oil, the dietary staple of the region, figs, dried or fresh depending on the season, grain, cheese made from goat or sheep milk, dried fish from the coast, a day's journey away, wool fleeces, woven cloth of basic quality, a few ceramic pots made by a local potter, some iron tools brought by a travelling smith who passes through periodically. The agora is also where public life happens. A notice has been posted on a painted board near the centre, something about a public festival coming in the next month, and the obligations of households to contribute to it. A group of men stands discussing this, occasionally looking at the board and then back at each other. The business of the market and the business of community life are not separate here. An older man sits near the edge of the space, not selling anything. He is watching. He has been coming to this market for 40 years and has watched it grow from a slightly smaller gathering to its present size, has watched certain sellers come and go, has watched the prices of things rise and fall with seasons and harvests. He knows this market the way he knows his own house, by long acquaintance, without having to think consciously about most of it. He is not thinking about any of this, because he is not thinking about it. He is simply sitting there, watching, in the warm morning, with the sound of the market around him, comfortable in a familiar place, letting time pass at its own pace. This is also what ancient markets looked like. Let us now consider the transaction in more detail, because the transaction, the exchange of goods for money or for other goods, is the fundamental unit of market activity, and understanding it more closely is understanding the market. Most ancient transactions were simple. A seller had something, a buyer wanted it. A price was agreed. The goods moved in one direction, and the payment moved in the other. Both parties moved on. But within this simplicity there was a great deal of social texture. The negotiation of price was a social interaction, not just an economic one. It required both parties to read each other, to gauge how much the other wanted the transaction, to assess what the fair price was, to decide how hard to push and when to accept. Skilled negotiators were not aggressive necessarily. Often the most effective approach was a kind of patient steadiness, a willingness to stand by one's position without drama. The moment of agreement, the moment when both parties had said yes to the same price, had a satisfying quality. Something had been concluded. The world had reached a small completion. The buyer had the thing they needed. The seller had the payment they sought. Both had participated in the ordinary miracle of exchange, which is that two people can each end up with something they value more than what they gave away. Payment itself had its texture. Coins, where they were used, were counted out by hand. The clinking sound of coins being counted and checked was part of the market's ambient sound. Silver coins were sometimes tested by biting. The softness of silver and the hardness of a copper coin plated with silver could sometimes be detected this way, though it was not entirely reliable. The weighing of silver by weight was more reliable, and in some markets weighing of payment was routine. In barter transactions, exchanges of goods for goods rather than goods for money, the matching of value was more complex. How many measures of grain for a good knife? How much cloth for an oil lamp? The calculations required both parties to know the approximate values of both commodities and to find a combination that both found acceptable. This could involve extended discussion, or could be settled quickly if both parties were experienced and the values were well understood. When barter involved more complex or larger transactions, the discussion could become something close to a mathematical exercise with various combinations proposed and evaluated. 10 measures of grain and 2 cheeses for the knife, or 15 measures of grain and no cheese. The seller and buyer work through the combinations until something worked for both. This problem, the problem of finding a suitable combination in barter, is one of the reasons that money, as a universal medium of exchange with an agreed value, was such a useful invention. Money simplified the calculation enormously. Once you knew the price of a knife in silver and the price of grain in silver, the exchange became straightforward arithmetic rather than a complex multivariable negotiation. Money, in ancient contexts, meant different things in different places. In the Mediterranean world, coins of silver and bronze were the most common monetary instruments by the classical period. In Mesopotamia, silver by weight was the medium of exchange without coins in the early periods. In West Africa, cowrie shells and cloth. In China, bronze coins with holes in the centre for stringing together. In parts of the ancient Americas, cacao beans and other commodities served monetary functions. Each monetary system reflected the resources and social arrangements of its place of origin, and each worked well enough within its context. The idea of money, something universally accepted in exchange for anything, with a value independent of its own utility, was powerful enough to emerge repeatedly in different societies without contact with each other, because the problem it solved was universal. Let us now rest for a while in this description and notice what we have done. We have spent time in several ancient markets, in different parts of the world, in different periods of history. We have stood at a pottery stall in a Roman forum. We have watched grain being weighed in a Babylonian market. We have followed the silk trade through Chinese market systems. We have seen gold and salt exchanged in West African trading towns. We have sat with an old man watching a small Greek agora on an ordinary morning, and in each case what we have found is roughly the same. Ordinary people doing ordinary things in a familiar place in the ordinary way of their time and culture. Markets were not extraordinary. They were the most ordinary places in the ancient world, the place where ordinary life organized itself around the exchange of ordinary goods at ordinary prices. That is what ancient markets were really like. Now let us go deeper into the details, because details are where the reality is, and details told slowly have a way of becoming restful. let us talk about the smells of markets, more specifically. The food section of any market smelled primarily of the food. In the Mediterranean, this meant the rich, fruity smell of olive oil, the sharper smell of fish, the yeasty smell of bread, the green smell of fresh vegetables when in season, the drier smell of legumes and grains. In a market in ancient India, the smell would have been different. Spices, particularly with their sharp and warm aromas, cumin and coriander and turmeric and pepper. In a market in ancient northern Europe, the smells were earthier: root vegetables, smoked meat, the lanolin smell of raw wool. The animal sections of markets had their own distinctive smells. Livestock markets, where cattle and sheep and goats and pigs and horses were bought and sold, smelled of manure and animal bodies, and the particular dusty smell of dry earth disturbed by hooves. These markets were often held at the edge of town, or in a designated area separate from the food market, partly for reasons of smell, and partly because the noise and movement of animals could disrupt the more orderly activity of the main market. The craft sections smelled of their materials. Leather had its particular smell: the tanning agents, the oil used to condition it, the animal origin of the material itself. Freshly turned wood had a clean, faintly sweet smell. Metal, particularly iron, had a slight metallic smell that was noticeable up close. Clay vessels, fresh from the kiln, had a mineral smell that faded as they were used. And underneath all of this, the smell of the people. A gathering of many people in a public space before the era of modern sanitation and regular bathing had a particular smell that was simply part of what public spaces smelled like, and that contemporaries did not notice or comment on any more than we noticed the particular smell of our own cities. Let us now think about the light in ancient markets. Most ancient markets were held outdoors, or in partially covered outdoor spaces, and so the light was natural light. The quality of that light changed through the day. Morning market, which was the most common timing. Markets usually opened at dawn or shortly after and closed around midday, had the quality of morning light, clear and directional, with long shadows from the east in the early hours that gradually shortened as the sun climbed. By mid-morning the light was good and even, suitable for examining goods carefully. The colours of cloth were accurate. The quality of pottery could be assessed. The freshness of vegetables was visible. This was when experienced buyers made their more careful purchases. By midday in Mediterranean climates the sun was directly overhead, and the light was harsh. The heat was building. People began to leave the market, retreating to shade and rest. The sellers who remained grew quieter. The activity wound down, and then the market was over for the day, and the sellers packed up their remaining goods and made their way home, and the open space of the forum or the agora was empty again, with only the marks of the day's activity, the stains, the dropped grain, the footprints in the dust, to show what had happened there. By the next morning the space was ready again. This rhythm, the daily or weekly filling and emptying of a market space, was one of the fundamental rhythms of ancient life. The market day imposed a structure on time. Things happened before market day and after market day and on market day. People oriented themselves in time partly by reference to the market, the way we might orient by reference to the days of the week. Let us now talk about the people who worked the market but were not exactly buyers or sellers in the usual sense. The money changers were one such group. In a world where different currencies circulated, different cities minted different coins, and travellers crossed between currency zones regularly, someone needed to exchange one currency for another. Money changers set up at market with their portable tables and their collections of different coins and their knowledge of current exchange rates. They offered to exchange coins of one city or region for coins of another, at a rate that included a profit for themselves. The profession was ancient and widespread. In the temples of Jerusalem, money changers operated in the temple courts, where they exchanged Roman coins, which bore the image of the emperor and were therefore considered idolatrous for temple offerings, for acceptable local currency. This is the exchange that the famous temple scene in the Christian Gospels describes, and it illustrates how routine and recognized the money changer's function was. Porters were another category of market worker. Not everyone who came to market with goods to sell could carry those goods themselves, or could move large or heavy purchases without help. Porters offered their labour, carrying loads for pay. They were typically men of modest means, selling the labour of their bodies as their primary economic contribution. The work was heavy and physical and paid modestly, and the porters were a permanent feature of any busy market. Scribes attended some markets, particularly larger commercial centres where written contracts were standard practice. A scribe at market was available to write up purchase agreements, contracts for larger transactions, receipts for payments. Literacy in the ancient world was unevenly distributed, and a literate person who could write these documents was providing a service that many merchants needed but could not provide for themselves. And then there were the entertainers. Not in every market, not in every culture, but in markets of sufficient size and duration, entertainers appeared. Musicians, jugglers, storytellers, animal trainers showing off trained dogs or birds. These were people making a living on the margins of the market economy, in the spaces where people gathered and had a moment to stop and watch. They passed a hat, or held out a bowl, and collected small contributions from those who watched, and then they performed again. Their presence made the market more than just a place of commerce. It made it a spectacle, a gathering, a place worth going to even if you had nothing to buy and nothing to sell. The market drew people because it was the most interesting thing happening in the vicinity, and the entertainers were part of that interest. Let us now talk about what happened when market transactions went wrong. Things went wrong in ancient markets in recognizable ways. Fraud was possible. Sellers who misrepresented their goods, who used false weights, who sold adulterated products, a grain seller who mixed good grain with grit or sand, or a cloth merchant who sold a short measure of cloth counted as a full one, was cheating their customers. How were these wrongs addressed? In organised market systems there were officials whose job it was to monitor commercial practice. Greek cities had officials called agoranomoi, market overseers, whose duties included checking weights and measures, monitoring the quality of goods sold and resolving disputes. Roman markets had similar officials. Chinese markets had their market administrators. The presence of official oversight was a recognition that without it, fraud would be more common and trust in the market would be reduced. For transactions that went wrong after the fact, a pot that turned out to be cracked, a piece of cloth that shrank unexpectedly, an animal that turned out to be sick, recourse was more difficult. There were legal mechanisms in some contexts, but pursuing a formal complaint was time-consuming and uncertain. More often, the remedy was informal. The buyer complained to the seller. The seller either made good on the complaint or did not, and the buyer remembered this when deciding where to buy in future. Reputation was the primary regulatory mechanism in most ancient markets. A seller who cheated buyers found that buyers went elsewhere. A seller who was reliable found that buyers came back and brought others. The market, over time, rewarded honesty through the simple mechanism of repeat business, and punished dishonesty through the simple mechanism of lost business. This mechanism worked imperfectly, as all mechanisms work imperfectly, but it worked well enough that markets continued to function, which is a kind of evidence for its effectiveness. Let us now think about the children at ancient markets. Children came to market with their parents, or were sent on small errands, or came to watch and to be in the busy public space. Children at market occupied the margins, the spaces between stalls, the edges of crowds, the peripheries of adult transactions. They watched, they ran, they found each other and played informal games in the open areas when there was space to do so. They begged for the small sweet things available at food stalls, a fig, a piece of honeyed grain cake, with varying success. For children, the market was an education in how the adult world worked. They saw the weighing of goods and the counting of money. They saw negotiation in practice, the back and forth of price discussion, the moment of agreement. They saw the variety of people, travellers from other regions with different clothing and speech, merchants of different backgrounds, craftspeople of different specializations. The market was one of the most cosmopolitan spaces available in the ancient world, and children absorbing its variety were absorbing knowledge about the larger world beyond their immediate experience. A child of 8 who had been to market a dozen times had learned, without being formally taught, the approximate prices of common goods, the signs of quality in food and craft items, the behaviours appropriate to commercial interactions, and the basic mechanics of economic exchange. This was practical knowledge that would serve them all their lives. Let us now walk slowly through the afternoon as the market winds down. It is past midday. The heat of the day is at its peak. Many of the buyers have gone home. The sellers who have sold out of their goods are packing up, folding cloth, collecting pottery that did not sell, tying shut the sacks of remaining grain. The sellers who still have goods to move are looking at what remains with a calculating eye, deciding whether to lower their prices to attract the remaining buyers, or whether to pack up and try again next market day. The food sellers are mostly out of cooked food. The empty pots and cold braziers tell the story of a morning's business. The bread seller has a few pieces of bread left, and is offering them at a reduced price to avoid carrying them home. Stale bread was less valuable than fresh, and fresh would be available again next market day. The forum or market space is littering up with the small debris of the day. Dropped grain, scraps of cloth, bits of straw from animal packing. A few children are picking through this debris in the systematic way of children looking for anything interesting. A dog has found something near the food seller's area and is investigating it with focused attention. A seller counting his day's earnings sits at his now empty table, moving coins from one pile to another, calculating. His expression is neutral. It was not a remarkable day. Some things sold, some things did not. The prices he received were more or less what he had expected. He will come back to the next market and do it again. The market officials, where they exist, make a final circuit of the space, checking that sellers who have departed have not left refuse behind that might create problems. They note any issues to be addressed before the next market day. They are bureaucrats doing bureaucratic work, careful and thorough and unexciting. By late afternoon, the market space is mostly empty. The sounds of commerce have faded. The town resumes its ordinary quiet, broken by the sounds of domestic life. Children called home for the evening meal, the sound of cooking, the occasional animal, the distant conversation of neighbours. Tomorrow, or in 8 days, or on the next market day of whatever interval this particular market uses, it will all begin again. The sellers will arrive with their goods, the buyers will come, the weighing and measuring and negotiating will happen, the coins will clink, the bread will be warm, the grain will be measured, it will be the same and different, and the same again. This is what ancient markets were really like. Now let us move slowly toward the end of this telling, because we have covered a great deal of ground, and the hour is late, and some of what we are saying now may be passing through your awareness without leaving much trace, and that is exactly as it should be. Ancient markets in Egypt happened along the Nile, in the towns and cities that the river made possible. The Nile was the source of water and of the fertile silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible, and it was also a highway. Boats moved up and down it constantly, carrying goods from one part of Egypt to another. Markets near the Nile received goods by water, and the market areas near the river docks had the additional smells and sounds of the waterfront: fish, river mud, the particular smell of boats and ropes and the Nile itself. Egyptian markets sold grain in quantity. Egypt was one of the most agriculturally productive regions of the ancient world, and its grain surplus fed not just Egypt but, in later periods, Rome. The grain trade of Egypt was enormous. Individual transactions in the local market were small pieces of this larger pattern. A farmer selling a portion of their harvest, a town buyer purchasing what they needed for the week. But the accumulated small transactions of many local markets constituted the vast grain trade that sustained empires. In the markets of ancient India, spices were prominent that were not found in other regions. India was the source of pepper, which was so valuable in ancient Mediterranean markets that it was sometimes called black gold. Ginger, cardamom, turmeric, cinnamon from the island now called Sri Lanka. These goods, from the Indian perspective, were agricultural produce. Things grown locally, sold locally, traded up through the system to merchants who would carry them westward. From the Roman perspective, they were luxury imports that commanded high prices and were associated with wealth and sophistication. The markets of ancient India also traded in cotton cloth. India was the primary source of cotton in the ancient world, and Indian cotton textiles were traded widely. Cotton cloth was lighter and cooler than wool for warm climates, and it took dye in vivid colours that wool did not replicate as well. Indian cloth merchants knew the qualities of their goods well, and buyers who came to buy cloth in Indian markets were dealing with people who had spent their lives in the textile trade. These are the markets of the ancient world, spread across continents and centuries, all doing the same basic thing: bringing together people who had goods and people who wanted goods in a place and time where both could meet and make their exchanges, The specific goods changed by location. The specific currencies changed. The specific rules and officials and customs changed. But the fundamental activity was the same everywhere, and it was the same for the same reason. Human beings need things they do not produce themselves, and other human beings produce those things, and the market is where this fundamental fact of human interdependence resolves itself, one transaction at a time. The person who grew the grain, and the person who made the pot, and the person who wove the cloth, and the person who caught the fish were connected through the market even if they never met each other directly. The market made these connections quietly and constantly in the ordinary way of things that simply work, and in working, the market made ancient civilization possible. Without the market, without the exchange of goods, and the specialization of labor that exchange makes possible, most of what we think of as ancient civilization, the great buildings, the art, the philosophy, the literature, could not have existed. The philosophers of Athens could think because they did not have to grow all their own food. The architects of Rome could design because they did not have to smelt all their own metal. The specialization that makes complex civilization possible rests on the market, on the ability to exchange what you make for what others make, so that each person can do the thing they do best. All of this large story was contained in the small story of the pottery seller in the Roman Forum, counting his coins at the end of a market day. And now we are near the end of our own day, and the things we have talked about are settling into the quiet behind the words, and the market of our telling is winding down, and the space is clearing, and what remains is the comfortable general knowledge that people in ancient times did ordinary things in ordinary places in ordinary ways, and that these ordinary things added up to something, and that you and I are among the things they added up to. Rest now. The market is closed for the day. The grain is measured and bagged. The pottery is wrapped and put away. The coins are counted. The sellers are walking home. The forum is quiet. The market will be there next market day, and so will the sellers, and so will the buyers, and the weighing and the negotiating and the clinking of coins will happen again. But that is then. This is now, and now is quiet, and now is enough. Sleep. A small addition for those still listening. If you're still awake, you're welcome to stay a little longer. There is no urgency in any direction. The market will keep. Let us talk once more about the market, but differently. Let us talk about what it felt like to be finished with the market, to have bought what you came for, or sold what you brought, and to be walking away, homeward. The walk home from market was a familiar pleasure. You knew the road. You had walked it many times. If you had sold well, there was satisfaction in the weight of coins in your pouch, or the lightened load on your back, and the feeling that the day had gone as it should. If you had bought well, there was the pleasure of knowing that the household would be provided for. The grain jar would be refilled. The new pot would replace the broken one. The cloth would become a garment before winter. The road away from the market was quieter than the road toward it. The morning crowds coming in were replaced by the afternoon traffic going out. You were among people going in the same direction, similarly laden, similarly finished with the public space of the market and returning to the private space of home. If the road was long, and sometimes it was very long, several hours of walking, you might fall into conversation with someone walking alongside you. Or you might walk in comfortable silence, thinking about nothing in particular, watching the road ahead and the fields to either side, letting your feet carry you forward with the automatic competence of feet that know a route well. The smell of the market faded. The smell of the countryside replaced it. The smell of turned earth, of vegetation, of the particular air of the fields in whatever season this was. Your own breathing slowed to the rhythm of walking. Your shoulders settled under the pack or the basket. Your mind quieted. This was the walk home from market. And then you arrived. The house was there, familiar. The fire had been kept, or was low and needed rebuilding. Someone at home was glad to see the goods you brought. The new pot was examined. The grain was poured into the storage jar with a satisfying sound, grain on grain, the store replenished. The market had done its work. It had connected you, through the ordinary miracle of exchange, to the farmer who grew the grain, and the potter who made the pot, and the merchant who brought the oil from far away. You were part of the network, and the network held. This was ancient life, not the dramatic version, the real version. And the real version was ordinary, and the ordinary was enough, and the enough was everything. The fire is warm, the stores are full, the walk is over, the day is done. Good night. More about the market, because there is always more. Let us return to the market one more time, not to the broad sweep of it, but to the very small details. The details that no one recorded because no one thought to record them. The details that were simply there, present, unremarkable, part of the texture of ordinary days, the ground of the market. In most ancient markets, the ground was simply the ground, earth or stone or packed gravel or clay, without any particular preparation for the purpose of a market. In established market towns, certain areas might be paved with flat stones, which made for easier walking and a less dusty surface. But in smaller markets, or in the open fields where seasonal fairs were held, the ground was the natural ground, with all the unevenness and variation that natural ground has. In dry weather, the ground of a market became dusty. The passage of many feet stirred up fine particles that settled on goods and people alike. By midday, on a busy market day in a dry season, the sellers and buyers at a busy outdoor market were all somewhat dusty. Their hair and clothing carried the fine, pale dust of the ground. The goods on display had a faint coating of it. The dust was breathed in and coughed out and simply endured, because it was not a serious problem, only a minor inconvenience that was inseparable from the experience of outdoor market. In wet weather, the ground became muddy. This was a greater inconvenience. Mud stuck to feet and to the hems of garments. Heavy loads were harder to move on slippery, yielding ground. Goods laid on the ground were in danger of getting wet. Sellers moved their ground cloths if they could, seeking higher or drier spots. But the market still happened, because the need to buy and sell did not go away because of weather, and experienced market-goers were prepared for mud in the same way they were prepared for heat and for cold, and for all the other conditions that outdoor life in any season produces. The ground of the market was also where dropped things ended up. A coin that slipped from someone's fingers fell to the ground and might be found immediately, or might be stepped on and pressed into the earth and lost. A piece of bread dropped by a child was immediately picked up, assessed for cleanliness, and either eaten or discarded depending on how hungry the child was and how dirty the bread. Spilled grain on the ground attracted birds, which were part of the ambient life of any market. Pigeons in the Mediterranean, sparrows, crows, whichever birds were local to the region, and had learned that markets produced food. The birds of ancient markets were as familiar a part of the scene as the sellers and the buyers. They knew the rhythms of market day. They arrived when the market opened and the food appeared, and they picked at whatever fell or was discarded, and they were chased occasionally when they became too bold, and they returned immediately afterward. They were not remarkable. They were simply there, as birds at markets have always been there, doing what birds at markets do. Let us also talk about water at the market. Water was needed at market for drinking, for the animals that came to market, for washing hands after handling fish or meat, for rinsing vessels before filling them with new goods. In markets near a river or fountain, water was available and people used it without thinking much about it. In drier or more remote markets, water was more carefully managed. Water sellers sometimes operated at large markets, carrying water in sealed vessels and selling cups of it to thirsty buyers. This is among the oldest recorded commercial transactions, the selling of water to people who need it and do not have it, and it happened in ancient markets across the world. The water seller with their clay jug and their small ceramic cup, offering a drink for a small coin, was a figure as familiar in ancient markets as the grain seller or the cloth merchant. People drank at market and were thirsty again. This is a fact of bodies that has not changed. The sellers standing at their stalls through the long morning drank water brought from home or purchased from the water seller, and they were thirsty, and they drank, and then they were thirsty again later. This is so ordinary as to be beneath mention, and yet it is part of what market days were like for the people who lived them. Let us think about counting. Counting was central to market activity. The counting of money, the counting of measures, the counting of items sold. All of this required reliable arithmetic, and arithmetic was a practical skill that market participants developed through necessity. A seller who could not count would be cheated. A buyer who could not count would be cheated. The children who grew up in market families were taught to count early and well, because counting was useful, and the failure to count was costly. The numbers used in ancient markets were not always the same as the numbers we use now. Different counting systems existed in different cultures, but the fundamental operation, assigning a number to a quantity, comparing quantities numerically, adding and subtracting quantities, was universal, because the need it served was universal. A seller at the end of market day counted the day's earnings and compared them to expectations. The coins were sorted by denomination and counted. The total was held in mind or noted, depending on the seller's literacy and habits. The result was information. It told the seller whether the day had been good or poor by their standards, and this information shaped decisions for the next market day. This small accounting, the end-of-day counting of earnings, happened at every market, in every period, in every culture that used a monetary economy. It was one of the most ordinary acts of market life. It required concentration and careful handling of coins, and it was done with the focused attention that handling money tends to produce in people across all cultures and times. The counting finished. The money was put away. The stall was packed. The day was over. Let us also say something about the margins of the market, the people and activities that happened at the edges of the main commercial activity. Beggars were present at ancient markets, where people with money gathered, People without money also gathered, hoping for charity. Ancient attitudes toward beggars and poverty varied by culture, but many ancient cultures had concepts of charitable giving that made markets a reasonable place for a beggar to be. In cultures where religious law prescribed care for the poor, ancient Judaism, for example, with its laws about leaving portions of the harvest for the poor, or ancient Islam with its prescriptions for almsgiving, the market was a space where those obligations could be discharged. A beggar at market might sit near the entrance or near the food sellers and ask for something from those who passed. Some people gave, some ignored. The beggar waited. This too was a form of market patience. The patience of someone waiting for charity in a place of commerce, their presence a reminder of the limits of the market economy, which could serve those with goods or money to exchange, but could not, by itself, serve those with neither. Travellers passed through markets. A market in a town on a road between two cities attracted travellers who needed to resupply, to buy food for the journey, water, fodder for animals, perhaps a replacement for something broken along the way. These travellers were not regular buyers in the market. They appeared once and disappeared. But their needs were no different from the needs of local buyers, and the market served them as it served everyone. Foreigners appeared at larger markets, traders from distant regions with different clothing and different speech and different goods. They were curiosities and also opportunities. They might have things for sale that were not locally available, and local sellers were interested in what they might want to buy. The presence of foreign merchants at a market was an indication that the market was significant enough to draw long-distance trade, which was a mark of commercial importance. These foreigners navigated the local market with the combination of confidence and uncertainty that characterizes any experienced traveller in an unfamiliar place. They knew how markets worked. The fundamental activity was the same everywhere, but the specifics were different. The language was different, which required either a translator or the use of gestures and the universal language of numbers. The currency was different, which required either exchange or the use of a commodity currency like silver by weight that both parties understood. The specific goods were different, which required looking and assessing things you had not seen before. Experienced foreign merchants handled all of this without great difficulty, because it was simply the ordinary challenge of their profession. They had done it many times in many places. They knew how to make transactions work across language barriers. They knew how to assess quality in unfamiliar goods. They knew how to find the information they needed in a market they had never visited before. And then they completed their business and moved on, and the market continued without them, as it had before they arrived. This is the nature of the market. It continues. Specific people come and go, specific transactions happen and are concluded, specific goods appear and are sold and disappear. But the market continues. The space fills and empties and fills again. The weights and measures are brought out and put away and brought out again. The coins change hands and find new purses and change hands again. The market continues day after day, market day after market day, through the seasons and the years and the decades and the centuries, until it does not. Because some ancient markets did eventually stop. Towns were abandoned, trade routes shifted, empires fell, and the commercial systems they supported fell with them. Markets that had operated for centuries went quiet. The ground that had known the footsteps of countless buyers and sellers went back to grass or sand or whatever the local nature offered to fill the absence. But in the long run, markets did not stop. They moved. They changed form. They adapted to new circumstances. The impulse to gather and exchange did not go away when a particular market went away. It found a new place. It found a new time. It organized itself around new goods and new currencies and new rules, because the impulse is not really about the market. It is about the connection. It is about the fact that what I make, you might need, and what you make, I might need. And in the meeting of those two needs, something happens that is larger than either of us individually. Something that makes civilization possible. Something that makes complexity and specialization and culture and all the rest of it possible. The market is how human beings help each other, without necessarily meaning to, simply by going to a place and buying and selling. This was as true in the forum of a Roman town 2,000 years ago as it is today, and it will continue to be true. Because the fundamental need for things you do not produce yourself, made by people you may never meet, available through the ordinary miracle of exchange, does not go away. It is simply there, like the market, quietly, persistently, ordinarily there. And now we are truly finished, and the telling is done, and the market of words has closed for the day, and the ground is emptying, and the last sellers are walking home with their unsold goods and their day's earnings, and the birds are picking at what fell, and the dust is settling, and the forum is quiet. Everything is quiet. The weight and the measure and the coin and the word. All quiet now. The market will be there next time, and you will be rested when it is. Good night. On the subject of market days and the passage of time, there is one more thing worth saying about ancient markets, and it is this. Market days organize time, in a world without the 7-day week as a universal standard. The 7-day week is not an ancient universal, but a specific invention that spread from particular cultures. Communities organized their time according to other rhythms. Agricultural rhythms, planting time, growing time, harvest time, religious rhythms, the festivals and holy days prescribed by whatever religion shaped the calendar, and market rhythms, the recurring interval between market days that gave structure to the weeks and months in much the same way that the weekend gives structure to our own sense of time. A market held every 8 days, a common interval in parts of the ancient world, produced a sense of time measured in 8-day cycles. Things were reckoned relative to the last market day or the next one. The days in between were the days between markets when you did the work of your household and your fields and your craft, and the days of market were the days when you entered the wider community and conducted commerce and gathered news. This rhythm of market time was deeply embedded in the life of communities that used it. You felt the approach of market day in the preparations, the gathering of goods to sell, the making of a mental list of things to buy. You felt the passage of market, day in the tiredness of the return journey, the satisfying heft of a basket of purchased goods, the lighter load of what you had sold. And then the quiet interval began again, and time moved in its accustomed way until the next market day came round. Children measured their time partly by market days. Going to market was an event in the week, a break from the routine, a chance to see more people and more things than the ordinary days offered. The market day had a different texture from ordinary days. Busier, noisier, more socially complex. It was anticipated and then experienced and then remembered as part of the rhythm of childhood. Old people remembered market days that no longer happened. The market at a town that had declined, or a market moved to a different location, or a market that had simply been discontinued when the trade route it served became less travelled. These remembered markets were part of the landscape of memory, the way specific details of specific times and places accumulate into a life. The memory of a market is an ordinary thing, and yet it is specific and sensory. The smell of the oil, the sound of the coins, the weight of the basket on the way home, the particular light of that particular morning. These sensory memories are among the most durable that humans have, and a person who had attended the same market dozens or hundreds of times over a lifetime carried within them a rich and detailed memory of the place. This memory was not particularly valued or examined. It was simply there, the accumulated deposit of ordinary experience, as natural and unremarkable as the memory of one's own house. And then the person who held the memory was gone, and the memory went with them, and the market continued without them, as it always had, until it did not, until it was also gone, and the ground where it had stood was quiet, and the birds that had picked at fallen grain found other places to forage, and the dust settled for good. And then time passed over the place and covered it, and what remained was what always remains of ordinary ancient life. Not the grand monuments, not the written records, but the ground itself, worn smooth in places, stained in others, containing in its layers the dropped coins and the broken pottery, and the occasional lost tool of 1,000 market days. This is what archaeology finds when it looks carefully. The market in the ground, the evidence of the ordinary, the trace of the transaction. And from this trace the story is rebuilt. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to know that people gathered here and bought and sold and weighed their grain and counted their coins and argued about prices and went home with their baskets full. Enough to know that ordinary life happened here, for a very long time, in the ordinary way. And that is enough. That is always enough. The coins are still in the ground somewhere, green with verdigris, waiting for the careful brush of the person who will find them centuries hence, and wonder what transaction they were part of and who held them, and where they went when the market day was over. And somewhere above the ground where the coins lie, in the quiet of now, someone is listening to a slow voice talking about ancient markets and the unremarkable ways of ordinary ancient life, and their breathing is slowing, and the market of the mind is closing up for the night, and the last sellers are going home in the gathering dark, and everything is settling. The grain is stored, the coins are counted, the basket is empty, the fire at home is warm. Sleep now, the next market day will take care of itself. It always has. Good night. A further accounting of small market details. We said good night, but you're still here, and so the market opens once more, very briefly, in the dim lamplight of a late hour, with no particular urgency and no particular destination. Just a few more observations about the unremarkable nature of ancient commerce, the scales. Balance scales were the primary weighing instrument of ancient markets, and they appeared in virtually every commercial culture that used standard weights. 2 pans suspended from a central beam, balanced so that equal weights on each side would bring the beam to horizontal. Place your goods on one side, your standard weights on the other, and when the beam balanced, you had your measurement. The making of a good set of balance scales required careful craftsmanship. The pans had to be of equal weight. The beam had to be perfectly balanced at its centre. The fulcrum, the point on which the beam rested, had to be smooth and consistent, allowing the beam to swing freely and settle accurately. A well-made set of scales could detect quite small differences in weight. A poorly made set was less reliable, and therefore less trusted by buyers who had learned to notice the difference. Many buyers carried their own sets of weights when they went to market so that they could verify the seller's measurements against their own standards. This was not an accusation of cheating, it was simply prudent practice. The seller who had accurate weights welcomed the check because it confirmed their honesty. The seller who tried to cheat with false weights found the attempt discovered and their reputation damaged. Standard weights in different ancient cultures took different forms. In ancient Egypt, weights were often shaped like animals. A weight in the form of a crouching ox, or a duck with its head turned back. These were functional objects, but also objects of some craft, made with care and sometimes decorated. In other cultures, weights were simple geometric forms, cubes, spheres, cylinders, chosen for precision rather than beauty. The set of weights used at any particular market were part of the material culture of commerce, as specific to their time and place as any other artifact. They sat on the scale, pan with the matter-of-fact solidity of objects that had a clear and understood purpose, and when the transaction was done, they went back into the seller's pouch and waited for the next use. Let us also talk about the voices of the market. The human voice was the primary medium of market communication. Prices were named by mouth, agreements were reached by speech, disputes were argued verbally, recommendations were given by word, reputations spread through conversation. The voices of the market had different registers. There was the calling out voice, the repetitive announcement of goods for sale, often a simple phrase repeated at intervals. This voice was designed to carry through the noise of the market and reach the ears of people some distance away. It was not a shout exactly. Experienced sellers learned to project their voice efficiently without strain. There was the negotiating voice, quieter, more direct, focused on the transaction at hand. This voice was addressed to one person, not to the general crowd. It had a different quality from the calling out voice, more conversational, more attentive to the responses of the other person. There was the greeting voice, the brief acknowledgement of a familiar buyer or a fellow seller, the short exchange of pleasantries that maintained social connection in the busy commercial space. Not a lengthy conversation. Market was not the place for lengthy conversation when buyers were present, but a nod and a few words between people who knew each other was part of the social texture of any regular market. And there was the quiet voice, the voice used when the market was slow, when there were no buyers immediately present, when one seller said something to the seller nearby in the unhurried way of people sharing a tedious stretch of time. These quieter conversations between sellers were a feature of every market. The social life that existed in the spaces between transactions. These voices are gone now. They left no record. The transactions they accomplished are known, where they are known at all, through the clay tablets and papyri and stone inscriptions that recorded some small portion of ancient commerce. But the voices themselves, their accents, Their particular expressions, their individual timbres, are entirely lost. What remains is the knowledge that they existed, that the Roman Forum was full of voices, that the Babylonian market by the river was full of voices, that the West African market town was full of voices. All the voices of all the ordinary ancient markets, conducting the ordinary commerce of ordinary days for thousands of years. All of them gone now into the same quiet, the quiet you're in now, which is not so different after all. The same silence that settled over every market when the day was done, and the sellers went home and the birds had taken what there was to take from the ground. The same silence, restful, complete. The market is closed. Everything that needed to be exchanged today has been exchanged. You can put down whatever you were carrying. It is not too heavy to set down. Just set it down and rest. The market will be open again when it is needed. For now it is quiet. For now everything is quiet. Good night. On the particular quality of market morning light, one last time. There is a quality of light in the early morning of a market day that is worth mentioning before we are entirely done. The sellers arrived before most of the buyers. They came in the early morning before full dawn sometimes to claim their customary spots and arrange their goods before the crowds arrived. In this early morning, before the market properly began, the light was still low and pale, the sky perhaps just lightening in the east, the air cool and quiet. The sellers set up in this light, working with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times. They moved with calm purpose, not hurrying but not dawdling. The goods came out of their sacks and baskets and were arranged in the familiar way. The scales were set up, the weights were checked, the samples of grain were placed at the front where people could see them. All of this happened in a light that was not quite day. The world was between things, between night and day, between rest and activity, between the private world of the household and the public world of the market. The sellers were in this in-between time, and they were comfortable in it because they knew it well. And then the light strengthened, the sun climbed, the buyers began to arrive, first one or two, then more. The voices began, the day properly started. But those early minutes, in the low light, with the goods being arranged and the world still quiet, those minutes had a particular quality that was part of what it meant to be a market seller in the ancient world. That light is still available every morning. Every morning before full dawn the light is that quality, pale and low and quiet. The market sellers of the ancient world stood in it without thinking about it, as they stood in it every market morning, as ordinary as breathing. And somewhere in that quiet light, the ancient markets are setting up one more time, the goods being arranged, the scales being positioned, the sellers taking their places, and then the day begins, as it always has, as it always will. Good night. The slow inventory of an ancient market stall. We will count the things on a market stall now, very slowly, because counting is one of the oldest and most reliable paths toward rest. There are 7 clay bowls of the small size stacked 2 and 2 and 2 and 1. Each bowl is roughly the same diameter across the top, roughly the width of 2 spread hands. Each bowl is the dull orange-red of fired local clay without glaze. The rim of each bowl is smooth, the edge turned slightly inward. At the base of each bowl, the mark of the potter. Small press symbol made before firing identifying who made it. There are 4 clay bowls of the larger size, not stacked, placed in a row. These are for storing grain or oil or water. Each is large enough to hold a day's water for a small family. Each has two small handles, slightly raised from the body, through which a cord could be passed for carrying or hanging. The clay of these bowls is slightly thicker than the smaller bowls, appropriate to the heavier use they will receive. There are two oil lamps. These are small, flat, open vessels with a spout at one end for a wick. They are made from the same clay as the bowls, but are shaped on a mould rather than thrown on a wheel, and the join of the mould halves is visible as a faint line around the middle. The oil lamp is a simple and practical object that has barely changed its form across centuries and cultures, because the simple and practical form works, and there is no need to change it. There are three small juglets, each the size of a large fist, each with a narrow neck and a single small handle. These are for carrying and pouring liquids in small quantities: perfume, expensive oil, medicine. They are slightly more carefully made than the storage bowls, the clay smoother, the form more even. Someone spent a little more time on these. There is one large amphora, standing upright on its pointed base in a wooden cradle that holds it stable. The amphora is for storing and transporting wine or oil in large quantity. It is taller than a child, with two handles at the shoulder and a narrowing toward the neck and again toward the pointed base. The base is pointed because amphorae were designed to be stored packed in sand or straw in the holds of ships, the pointed base pressing into the packing material and staying stable. But this one is not on a ship. It is in the market, held in its wooden cradle, waiting for a buyer. There are two cooking pots, shallow and wide, of a dark, gritty clay that is different from the storage clay, chosen for its resistance to the thermal shock of being placed directly on fire. The cooking pots are undecorated and no nonsense, their only concession to appearance being the evenness of their walls and the smooth working of their lips. They are the most practical objects on the table. They will be used every day if they are sold. They will last years if they are not dropped. The seller knows each of these objects. He made them, or watched them being made in his workshop, and he fired them, and he transported them to market. He knows which ones are his best work and which ones are more ordinary. He knows the tiny flaw in the base of the second largest bowl, a small bubble in the clay that fired without bursting, leaving a slight unevenness, and he will price that bowl accordingly. He knows that the large amphora is well made and worth a good price, and that he will not accept a low offer for it. He knows his inventory the way you know the contents of your own pockets, without having to look at it from long familiarity, because these are his things and he has lived with them for weeks since they came out of the kiln. He stands behind his table. He waits. The morning is not hurrying. The goods are arranged. The light is good. Someone will come. They always do. He waits, and we wait with him, in the unhurried morning, in the quiet before the day fully begins, in the particular piece of a thing not yet started, a transaction not yet made, a conversation not yet had. We wait. There is no urgency. There never was. There is only the morning and the goods and the waiting and the light, and the occasional sound of the market waking up around us, and the smell of bread from somewhere nearby, and the distant sound of water, and the feeling of having nowhere particular to be, and nothing particular to do except be here, in this moment, in this ancient market, on this ordinary morning, which is any morning, which is this morning, which is the morning that always was and always is and always will be, somewhere, in some market, in some part of the world, where ordinary people are setting out their goods and waiting for buyers, and living their lives in the unhurried, unremarkable, entirely sufficient way of ordinary people across all of time. Rest now. You're in good company. The seller is here. The goods are arranged. The morning is quiet. Everything is as it should be. Good night. One last observation. The coins of ancient markets are still being found. Every year in fields and riverbeds and former town centres, coins that changed hands in ancient markets are found by people who were not looking for them, or by archaeologists who were. A bronze coin dropped in the dust of a market 2,000 years ago comes out of the earth green and worn and small, and someone holds it and thinks, someone held this once, in a market, on an ordinary day. That is the connection. That small green coin, that ordinary transaction, that unremarkable market day. They reach across the distance of years and say, we were here. We bought and sold. We weighed and counted. We went home when the market was done. We were here. And now you are here. And one day you will not be. And the world will continue as it always has, with its markets and its ordinary days and its people, conducting the ordinary business of being alive. And that is not a sad thing. That is simply what it is to be part of the long, ordinary, unremarkable, entirely sufficient human story. The market goes on. The coins change hands. The grain is measured. The day ends. Sleep well. You have been here. That is enough. Good night. The seller who has been here the longest. There is, in every ancient market that lasted long enough, a seller who has been coming for longer than anyone else can remember. Not a legendary figure, not someone notable, simply someone who arrived at the market so many times over so many years that their presence became part of what the market was. Perhaps it is the old woman with the dried herbs. She has been coming to this market since before some of the current sellers were born. She knows the spot she always takes, the third place along the eastern side, in the shade of the wall in summer and in the sun in winter, because she has been taking it for 20 years, and before her, her mother took it, and everyone knows it as her spot and does not take it even when she is late. Her herbs are tied in small bundles with strips of reed. She knows all of them by smell as much as sight. She reaches into her basket without looking and pulls out what she needs, because her hands know the contents of the basket as well as she does. She knows what each herb is good for, and she tells buyers, and sometimes she is right in ways that matter, and sometimes she is simply repeating what she was told, and what she tells in turn, and the information passes from generation to generation through the market stall with no particular ceremony. She has sold herbs here through bad harvests and good ones, through cold winters and hot summers, through changes in who governed the town and which roads were most travelled. The market has changed around her. New sellers appeared, old ones stopped coming. The arrangement of the stalls shifted a little over the years, and she has remained in her spot with her dried herbs, in the third place along the eastern side. She's not thinking about any of this. She's sitting in her spot in the morning light with her herbs in their bundles around her. A buyer comes and asks about something for a cough. She reaches into the basket. She names a price. The buyer pays. She adds the coin to the small purse at her side. She settles back into her waiting. Time passes at the speed that time always passes, which is to say, at a constant rate, but feeling slower or faster depending on what is happening. Nothing much is happening. The morning is passing. The market is doing what markets do, and she is here, as she has always been here, and the herbs smell the way they have always smelled, dry and faintly medicinal and comforting in the way of familiar things. And the morning is quiet enough, and warm enough, and fine enough, and she is not in a hurry. She has learned, over the many years of coming to this market, that there is no benefit in hurrying. The buyers come when they come. The day ends when it ends. The walk home takes the same time regardless of how you feel about it. The herbs either sell or they do not, and the ones that do not come back to market next time, and eventually they sell, and that is fine. That is simply how it is. She knows this. She sits with this knowledge in the morning light, in her spot, as she has sat for 20 years, as her mother sat before her, as someone will sit after her, in the same spot, with different herbs or the same herbs or different goods. Entirely depending on how things go, the spot will be there. The morning will come, the market will open. And in the third place along the eastern side, in the shade in summer and the sun in winter, someone will be sitting, with their goods arranged around them, waiting for buyers with the patient competence of someone who has done this before and will do it again, as it always has been, as it always will be. Somewhere, in some market, in some part of the world, right now, someone is sitting in their spot with their goods arranged, waiting for the day to proceed at its own pace. They are not anxious. They are simply there, in the morning, in the market, doing what people in markets have always done. And you can rest in that knowledge, the knowledge of all those ordinary mornings and ordinary market days and ordinary transactions and ordinary walks home, stretching back through all the years of human commercial life, all the way back to the first time two people stood across from each other with things to exchange and found a way to agree, and both walked away with something they needed. Rest in that, in the long, ordinary continuity of it, in the unremarkable persistence of people getting along, one transaction at a time, one market day at a time, through all the years that have been, and all the years that are yet to come. The scales are balanced, the goods are measured, the coins are counted, the day is done, and you are warm, and the market is quiet, and everything is as it should be. Good night. The weight of a measure of grain. A measure of grain has a particular weight, not a dramatic weight, simply the weight of a measure of grain, which is dense and slightly yielding when you press your hand into it, and which pours in a slow stream from one vessel to another, with a soft rushing sound that is one of the most ordinary sounds of ancient markets. The grain seller lifts the measuring vessel and tips it. The grain pours. The sound is brief, and then stops when the vessel is empty. The seller sets the vessel down. The buyer looks at what has been poured. Both parties are satisfied, or not, and the negotiation proceeds accordingly. This happened many millions of times in ancient markets across the world. The lifting of the vessel, the pouring of the grain, the soft sound, the setting down, all of it ordinary, all of it sufficient, all of it part of the great fabric of ordinary life that has always been and will always be the majority of human experience, by a vast proportion, far outnumbering the dramatic moments, the historical events, the things that get written down and remembered. The pouring of grain does not get written down, but it happened every market day, in every grain market, in every culture that grew grain, for thousands of years. It happened this morning somewhere. It will happen tomorrow. The grain pours, the sound is brief, the market continues, and you can rest in the sound of it. That small, soft, rushing sound of grain being measured, as ordinary as breathing, as constant as the market, as unremarkable and as real as everything we have talked about tonight. The sound fades, the market closes, the day is done. Sleep now. Good night. The last buyer of the day. The last buyer of any market day is never remarkable. They arrive when the sellers are already thinking about packing up. The selection is reduced. Some things are gone. Other things remain, the items that did not sell, waiting to be carried home and brought back next time. The last buyer walks through the quieting market. Some stalls are already folded up and gone. Others are in the process. A few remain fully open, their sellers determined to stay until the end in case one more transaction presents itself. The last buyer looks at what remains. Perhaps they find what they need. Perhaps they settle for something slightly different from what they had intended. Perhaps they find something they had not been looking for and decide to take it, because the price at the end of the day is sometimes lower than the price in the morning, and the seller would rather sell at a reduced price than carry the goods home. The transaction is made. The last coins of the day change hands. The last goods of the day are wrapped and placed in the last basket. The last buyer walks away. The seller begins to pack up in earnest. The market is over. The ground is quiet. You were there, and now you are here, and here is also quiet, and the day is also over, and the things that needed to happen today have happened, and the things that can wait until tomorrow will wait, because tomorrow is also a day, and the market will be there again when it is needed. Tonight is for rest. This moment is for rest. Let the ancient market settle into the background of your mind, a distant hum of commerce and ordinary life, grains being measured, coins being counted, pots being examined, cloth being felt, between fingers, all of it happening somewhere just out of sight, just below the threshold of attention. A constant gentle background noise of people exchanging things and going home. That is the sound of the ancient world. That is the sound to fall asleep to. Ordinary, constant, quiet. Good night. The dust of the market has settled. The scales are put away. The standard weights sit in their pouch. The measuring vessel is empty and clean. The coins from the day's transactions are in the pouch at the seller's side. A satisfying weight, or a modest weight, or whatever weight this particular day produced. Enough for what is needed, or nearly enough, or a little more than expected. The day was what it was, and now it is done, and the walk home is the same walk home as always. This is enough now. This is a good place to stop. The market has been fully visited, and the sellers have been seen, and the buyers have been understood, and the ordinary miracle of ancient exchange has been described in all its unhurried, unremarkable, entirely sufficient detail. Rest. The ancient markets rest, and so can you. Good night.